So, Mark,
Okay.
the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Sue. Well, as a little background, I had the pleasure of meeting Alicia about 9 months ago at one of Westminster's adult education classes. During our brief discussion, following the meeting, I learned that Alicia's passion for racial and social justice and gender equality. I also learned of her capabilities to advance transformative change in these areas. So therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Alicia Clark. Alicia is a structural strategist and thought leader with more than 30 years of experience working in the nonprofit, public, and private sectors. She has led and launched initiatives to advance systemic change. Alicia founded Delaware's National Coalition of 100 Black Women chapter, a leading advocacy voice on Black women that promotes gender equity in health, education, and economic empowerment. She served as strategic advisor to establish the HOE Commission Achievement Center, the foremost provider of reentry services directly responsible for reducing the recidivism rate for high-risk, formerly incarcerated men. She founded and led a faith-based movement targeting inequities and racism, which led to the creation of structural reforms within the state of Delaware, policy reforms, and creation of Delaware's Office of Equity and Inclusion, a new cabinet position, Secretary of Human Resources, and the state's uniform anti-discrimination policy. So, Alicia, thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to gaining a better understanding of structural racism within Delaware, the challenges that are uncovered, and the opportunities for reform. So, Alicia, we turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and thank you for the lovely introduction. You forget about how much you do until someone reminds you. So thank you for sharing a little bit about my background. And again, I want to thank the organizers and also thank Westminster's Peace and Justice Work Group for hosting this type of forum where information can be shared and discussed. I shared with Mark and Carol that I wanted this to very much be and Sue, who was really good about following up with me to make sure we got this on the calendar, that I wanted this to be a discussion and an interaction of sorts. So I do have a PowerPoint that I want to just sort of walk through to provide some context and history about the work, and then we can move into discussion and dialogue and hopefully some um, thoughts about action and actionable items that this group can potentially undertake or at least consider in the days ahead. So I'm going to share my screen if I have permission.
You should have permission. You are a co-host, so why don't you
Okay.
give that a try?
Okay.
There you go.
Is it there?
Yeah, it is. It says double click to enter full screen mode. There you go.
Okay. Can I double click? Okay. Okay, it's not there. I don't want this. I'm not very tech savvy, so how do I get rid of this stuff on the side? Let's see.
I think you should be able to go to the top and it should say slideshow. Over to the right of transitions, does it say slideshow?
I don't see it. Does it, I don't see it. Oh, wait, it's down here at the bottom. Give me 2 seconds.
Yeah, every computer is a little different.
Yeah,
And
okay,
it should say start from first screen or start from current screen. Right.
okay. Is that it?
There
Is
you go.
that good?
There you
Okay,
go.
okay, okay, now we're cooking. Okay, Okay, so again, this is the Peace and Justice Work Group, and I am Alicia Clark, and founder of Delaware Faith in Action Campaign, which was an um, a organization that was founded for the purpose of bringing different groups together to support a common agenda. So it was a loosely formed organization, but it allowed us to work towards some common goals and objectives. So let's see. Okay, alrighty. So let me go to the next slide. Okay, so this initiative was actually launched in 2015, and gosh, it's hard to believe it was 10 years ago. When I was preparing for this evening, I was going back through all of my notes and slides and pulling things together. And so we actually started in about 2014 with some of the initial meetings that were held to assist individuals who were coming to the faith-based leaders for assistance and support with individual sort of issues they were having in the workplace. And I've worked with the Interdenominational Ministers Action Council, or IMAC, for the last 20 years or so. And what I discovered was that there were a number of consistencies in terms of the complaints that we were having. So I organized a meeting and invited, I think there were about 12 or 15 different individuals, primarily from the Department of Labor, to come and meet with us to share what their experiences were. And what was clear after the meeting with those 12 was that there was, there were some systemic issues that we were dealing with. And it wasn't just a case here and a case there, but there were consistencies in terms of the issues we were hearing and the names of the individuals that we were hearing over and over again in terms of the complaints. So fast forward, we moved quickly to organizing protest because we realized that there were many attempts to bring this to the attention of leadership, and those complaints and those concerns were being ignored time and time again. And so what we did, or what I did, was began the process of organizing leadership throughout the state. So starting with faith-based leaders in Newcastle County, then moving to Kent, and then moving to finally to Sussex County. And so these are just some of the photos from some of the protest march that we organized, or that I organized. And I put a couple of captions in here because I just wanted you to have some context in terms of what we discovered. And from 2012 to 2015, for example, there were 190 complaints filed against different state agencies with the Office of Anti-Discrimination at the Department of Labor. And out of that 190 complaints that were filed, only one had cause finding, which means that the Department of Labor, through their investigation, determined that only one case out of 190 had merit. So these were the sort of systemic structural issues that it became very clear were problematic. And this was largely due to the fact that the HR function was housed within the state agency, which meant the HR director reported into directors and then reported into the secretary. So if you're filing a complaint against a director or a manager or the secretary, and the HR and EEO representative is reporting into those individuals, then the majority of the time the investigation was flawed, if there was ever even an investigation at all. And so we saw this consistently from department to department and from agency to agency. Out of the 200 testimonials that we collected over the time frame of the hearings that we held, 40% of them were from residents living in Kent and Sussex counties. So this was not just isolated to one county, but it was statewide, where we were experiencing these issues. So the process and the methodology that was utilized, I went about the process of organizing hearings across the entire state. What the meetings with the 12 or 15 individuals initially provided perspective, but it didn't tell us everything that we thought we needed to know. And so what we shared with the leadership, both the faith leaders and the NAACP leadership that I was working with, was that it was more appropriate for us to organize hearings throughout the state to gather more information, to gather more data, so that we could better understand where the problems lie and what extent of problems were we really sort of looking at and dealing with. So as you can imagine, this was no small feat. And it was primarily me with leadership that was coordinating and organizing everything. So we hosted 9 hearings across the state, 3 in each county. The sessions were held at faith-based institutions and faith-based organizations, because we wanted a safe place for people. And we had great support and great participation from our faith leaders throughout the state. As you witnessed from the first slide, we held protests in Newcastle County, Kent, and Sussex, because we also recognize that in order for there to be a level of urgency as well as attention on this matter, that we needed to go public, because there had been years and years of behind the closed door sort of conversations and discussions about these issues, and that had not benefited the state employees or the state workers at all, or the organizations who were involved in trying to move the needle in some of this work historically. So the protests were central to the work moving forward. The very first meeting we had at Ezion Fair Baptist Church in Newcastle County, we had no idea how many people were going to attend. We made the arrangements to have the session. We pushed the information out to the community, and literally showed up that evening waiting to receive people, and but had no idea of how many people would come. We didn't require anyone to register, because we didn't want there to be any barriers to people showing up. We hired a court reporter, because I wanted all of the testimonials to be transcribed, and we videotaped all the hearings. The very first meeting, we had over 200 people show up. It knocked us away, because we really didn't anticipate that many people coming, but they did come. Some came to observe, some came to share their testimonies. There were individuals who walked in the church with boxes of data and documents that they had been collecting for years and years and years, complaints that they had filed that had gone nowhere and nothing had been done with them. And they shared that information with us. We engaged the media, local radio, Black media, Wilmington News Journal, and I spent several months before we went public in conversation with the editorial board of the Wilmington News Journal, because we petitioned for them to assign us an investigative reporter, and they did. And so there had to be a level of trust built. There had to be some due diligence that they wanted to do to make sure that this was justifiable and that it was valid and there was validity and credibility to what we were bringing forth. And after about 3 or 4 months, they moved forward with us and began to cover the activities. It just so happens that it was Carl Baker, who you probably know because he's been a reporter with the News Journal and with Spotlight Delaware now for some years. But I met Carl when he first moved here from the Midwest, and he was the investigative journalist that I worked very closely with to cover the story. We mobilized faith community members in the NAACP. I consulted closely with the Maryland Civil Rights Commission. The Maryland Civil Rights Commission is an entity that was actually established in 1964 after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And it was put in place to monitor, evaluate, and to also advance the civil rights agenda in the state of Maryland. They are an independent entity that has autonomy and sovereignty and the ability to pursue investigations as well as file litigation and lawsuits on behalf of individuals. So they were very helpful in terms of a sounding board and a model and a template that I was also advocating that we adopt here in the state of Delaware for that exact reason. The testimonials were gathered from the hearings that were held throughout all 3 counties. I brought on board an attorney to work with us to assist with preparing the report and the findings and documentations, and we submitted that information to the governor for his response and reaction. We met with and petitioned for support the legislators. We met with the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney General, the State Attorney General, the congressional delegates, Coons, Carper, Carney at that time, as well as engaged the EEOC, Philadelphia District Office, and the U.S. Department of Justice. But there was no movement. There was no support, and there was no movement from those entities. Also met with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and NAACP General Counsel and one of the law firms in Washington, D.C. that had worked on the heirs property case in South Carolina with a number of members of the Gullah Geechee community who had been wrongfully displaced, and their property had been taken through eminent domain, and there was a large lawsuit, and Reelman Colfax was behind that lawsuit, and they were able to bring justice for those petitioners. They were interested in the case. However, there was some additional due diligence that they needed for us to do, meaning in Delaware, for me to do in Delaware. And I just didn't have the capacity to move forward with those requirements in order to see this class action suit filed, which is what I was really advocating for. Let's see. One of the concerns that was made very apparent as we conducted this kind of investigation and work was the impact that it had on individuals. And so as we gather testimonials and information from individuals, we asked a series of questions. One was, did you file a complaint? And if you did, what happened? Do you have documentation? We also asked the question, how have you been impacted? because it was very important for us to understand the harm that was done. And as you can imagine, a number of people certainly experienced financial hardships if they had been fired from their jobs or suspended. And there were a number of cases where people have been wrongfully terminated. There were other cases where, because of the stress associated with navigating this process and not getting relief or support, the health status of individuals was very much compromised. And so we heard feedback often that people had developed high blood pressure, that they were now on several anxiety and depression medications. A couple of people had suffered heart attacks, a stroke. And there was one woman who actually had a nervous breakdown, and had to be institutionalized and hospitalized because of the stress associated with navigating the process. And what I think is important for you to recognize is that the systems and the structures were broken, and to a large extent they still remain broken. So when a person is confronted with an issue in the workplace, there's a protocol that they have to follow. So you have to file a complaint. That complaint is then
Oh my God, these
over
people.
the complaint is then reviewed by the at that time the HR and the EEO representative. And when we were doing this work, we found out that the human resource specialist was also the EEO specialist. So they were wearing dual hats in the majority of the cases, which that should not have been the case, but that's how things were structured. And that HR or EEO person then had the duty and the responsibility to follow up and launch an investigation. Now, in some situations, the investigation never happened. The complaint just went away, or they arbitrarily just decided that there was no merit and closed the case. When that happened, it created challenges for the individuals who were filing the complaints, because they had, in some instances, no recourse. They could either go to the Philadelphia EEOC and file another complaint to ask for an investigation, or they could go hire a lawyer. The majority of the state workers that we saw were African American, Latino. Overwhelmingly, they were at the lower rung of the employment ladder, so their income levels did not afford them the opportunity or the ability to hire a lawyer. Delaware has very few lawyers that will take cases dealing with employment law and discriminatory law, so it's hard to find one. And when you do find one, the majority of the time they wanted a $5,000 or $7,500 retainer in order to represent you. So that's one problem, structural problem. The other factor that we found out was that Delaware had something called a work share agreement with the Philadelphia EEOC. And this is not something that's uncommon. It's the way things are structured within the Department of Justice and the way the EEOC office works with state labor and Office of Discrimination divisions. But what that means is that if someone wanted to bypass the state system, the Delaware Department of Labor system, because they felt that they would not receive the type of attention, or that the investigation would not be pursued, and they wanted to just go straight to the Philadelphia EEOC office, they could file that complaint. But with the work share agreement, what that meant was that the Philadelphia office would then contact the Delaware Department of Labor to notify them that this case had been filed and they were going to be launching an investigation. And then they would work with the local Department of Labor on the investigation. So there were several instances where this became problematic because now you've notified the department that I work for that I have filed a complaint. And now not only am I dealing with the discrimination issue, now I'm faced with retaliation. And the response that individuals would receive is, if you're being retaliated against, then you need to come in and you need to file another complaint stating that now you're being retaliated against. And oftentimes the entire investigation process would take a year, maybe 2 years or 3 years before there was any resolution. Overwhelmingly, the outcome for most of these cases was the individual would receive what's called a right to sue letter. That means that the Philadelphia EEOC office, which stands for Equal Employment Office or Commission, would not take the case and pursue it on your behalf. They would give you a letter that you could then take to an attorney, or you could use that to file your own pro se case in federal court or superior court for discrimination. And so the majority of time when individuals would receive a right to sue letter, again, if you don't have the means and you don't have the ability to represent yourself pro se or hire an attorney, it was really a useless document that you were then issued, and there was no resolution that people received. So we brought in this dynamic healthcare professional named Dr. Camera Jones, who has done a lot of work in this space around the impact of racism and race and health. And we held a series of workshops where we invited in representatives from the state, as well as individuals from the community and some of the other leaders, to sort of bring a greater deal of education and awareness about the impact that this was having on the health and wellness of individuals in the workplace. What we also wanted to highlight was the fact that when you are subjecting individuals to a toxic environment, which is what the state agencies really represented, not only are you impacting the health and welfare of those individuals in the workplace, you are also contributing to inefficiencies in the workplace. So the services and the deliverables that the state agencies should be providing and the level of productivity they should be providing is greatly compromised. And there are a number of deficiencies and inefficiencies that you see occur because it's not a healthy environment. It's a very toxic environment. So the productivity level is very low. People are taking off from work. They're out on FMLA because of stress and other factors. And when there is a morale issue because people feel defeated, unheard, and abused, then you're also not getting the level of productivity in the workplace that you should have as well. So the race and health component became really important throughout this process. So I shared with you that we conducted these hearings, and I just wanted to share with you some of the findings because the racism was so overt in certain places that it was shocking. In Kent and Sussex County, there were reports of nooses in the workplace, banana peels that were thrown in the walkway when Black employees were coming in for work, Aunt Jemima cookbooks that were brought into the workplace and given to Black employees. There was name calling, nigger, black bitches. I mean, all of these things were happening in the workplace and being reported without there being any um, um, swift and corrective action. Oftentimes there was harassment, people were under surveillance, there was retaliation, unfair discipline, firing, demotions, others, who white employees being promoted over black employees who had more seniority and more experience, the mental and physical health issues I shared with you, FMLA, and on and on and on. And what also began to happen as I traveled up and down the state and began to collect this information and meet with people, and there was such a fear factor, particularly when we moved to Kent and Sussex County, people were afraid. Now, normally, if there's something that happens in the workplace, you should be able to go to HR, report it, and you have some sort of recourse and protections in place as the investigation or the research is being conducted. But there was a fear because people knew that oftentimes things were reported and there were no protections and that there was no resolution at the end. So I found myself at times meeting people who wanted to share their story, but they were afraid to be seen publicly with me. They didn't want people to know that they were talking with me. So we set up a hotline, but I also would meet wherever they wanted to meet me, behind the gas station, in the Dunkin' Donuts, at the McDonald's, behind the church, wherever I needed to be to meet with them, and to also ensure that they had that I had their trust and confidence in this process as well. As the word spread that we were working on this, matter in state government, I also started to get phone calls from individuals outside of state government who were sharing with me the issues that they were having in the workplace. And those calls came from the county, those calls came from the city, they came from the private sector, Purdue, UPS, University of Delaware, Christiana Care, some of the banks in Delaware. And what I understood was happening was the Department of Labor, which housed the Office of Anti-Discrimination, had responsibility for investigating these cases. This campaign started with the Department of Labor with the Department of Labor because the issues were so pervasive at the Department of Labor. And so think about it this way: if the Department of Labor is the agency that has responsibility for investigating discrimination practices for the entire state, if that environment is toxic and they are not following through on investigating issues and complaints within their own respective agency, then they certainly weren't doing it across the state. And that's what was quickly revealed, that there were major gaps and problems in terms of structurally and systematically what was happening. And so the due diligence and the follow through on complaints was just not happening. What we also uncovered was that the unions who had responsibility for representing individuals who worked in state government, they also were not representing individuals when it came to discrimination cases. I had conversations with union reps and asked, could they share data with me on the number of discrimination cases they were working on or reviewed. And I was told that discrimination cases are labor intensive, time intensive. They don't have the budget to deal with them. And so they refer everyone to the Philadelphia EEOC. So again, this is just sort of a review of the different findings that were uncovered. And what we know about Delaware in general, that there were already consent decrees in place with DHSS and the state police because they had been sued by the U.S. Department of Justice and had signed off on consent decrees, again, for discrimination and other types of retaliatory complaints that were happening there. What was also interesting in this process was that I launched this campaign and started working on this in 2014. There were articles that were shared with me by state employees that an expose was done by the Wilmington News Journal in 1994 exposing the exact same issues about discrimination in state government. So here we were 20 years later, and the same issues were still, very prevalent and problematic within state government. So once we completed our review and report, there were a list of recommendations that were advanced to the governor at that time, who was Jack Markell. The governor met with us and initially asked what did we want to do, and we told him we weren't sure and we didn't know what needed to be done until we had these hearings, and we would come back to him with our findings. So he was supportive in that he issued a letter to the 14 or 15,000 state employees through their distribution list, stating that we had that he had agreed to allow us to host these hearings or work with us or cooperate with us in hosting these hearings, and that state employees who were in the workplace and had had any issues should feel free to go to these hearings and share their story. And if anyone was retaliated against, it should be reported immediately so that there could be recourse and some protections put into place. So that was helpful in terms of initially encouraging people to come out and share their stories. I have to tell you, when I was in Kent County, when we held our first session in Kent County, I'll never forget, I was sitting there we were at Wycote United Methodist Church, and the way we held the hearings was people would come in and they would sign in, and then they were offered a seat, and we had a panel of 3 individuals who would ask them questions, sort of interview them, and then we were recording their testimony, and then they would be allowed to leave. If they had any documents they wanted to leave with us, we collected those documents. And I'll never forget, on this one particular day, there was a woman who came in and she had signed in, and then she went and sat down. And then about 5 minutes later, she came back up and she said, "Can you scratch my name off the list?" And I said, well, no, we don't remove anyone's name. If you came, it's important for us to record that, that you were here just for our records. And she said, well, no, I'm not going to speak. I don't want to speak because my supervisor sent someone here to watch me, and I'm afraid to speak. So I told her I would cross her name off, and I did cross her name off, and I asked if she wanted to have a private interview later, and she told me that she did, and she left the session. And so that type of fear and surveillance was happening in a number of in a number of agencies throughout and across the state. So the slate of recommendations that we put forth was for there to be a U.S. Department of Justice investigation into state government employee practices and patterns, because this was not a one-off here and there. The state was engaging in patterns and practices of discrimination and retaliation, and going back as far as 1994 to 2014. And the campaign that I worked on, I think we concluded around 2017, there were consistent patterns showing agencies and the discriminatory practices that they were involved in. We wanted them to provide prompt remedial action for state employees filing retaliation complaints because of the danger associated with not protecting people. As I said before, if there was a complaint filed and then the state knew about it, you were subjected then to retaliation. And the state did absolutely nothing to protect people. They didn't remove the supervisor, and oftentimes you had to go right back into that environment and work under that supervisor or manager that you had reported. We asked for a task force to continue the work of implementing recommendations and provide support to OMB, who was managing the assessment process. We asked them to establish a uniform anti-discrimination policy because one did not exist in the state, which was a major part of the problem. So you have 17 or 18 different state agencies. Every state agency had their own anti-discrimination policy. So there was no consistency across the board. We recommended that they review and revise the Title 19 Labor and Employment Practice Statute, which had not been updated since the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And we petitioned for them to create an independent Delaware Commission on Civil Rights with sovereign immunity. So those were the recommendations that were advanced from our investigation and findings. What was also of concern and issue that we wanted to pursue was the fact that Title VII stipulates that you're not to prohibit that discrimination is prohibited based on color, race, religion, sex, and national origin. And there's Title VI that really connects to Title VII, because if you are in violation of any of these prohibitions, it also states that the funding that you receive from the federal government should also be withheld or suspended, because Title VI violations are directly tied to the governance of entities and whether there are Title VII violations. So, you know, these two pieces of statute, these two statutes and pieces of legislation are really inextricably linked. But there was never a discussion or utilization of this as sort of a tactic or a leveraging point, I would say, to incentivize or move these agencies and the leadership into compliance and into a sort of corrective action in terms of your funding possibly being compromised or withheld. But that was something that we certainly were aware of and brought to the attention of the administration as well. So after all of the work that was done, what we accomplished was the following. The report was shared with the governor. He then allocated about $500,000 to conduct an HR assessment of state agencies. We petitioned for this and asked that agency be an independent agency outside of Delaware because of how incestuous Delaware is and all of the relationships that are here that are problematic. And we wanted it to be an unbiased and credible review and assessment. We wanted the state to move to centralize the HR function in state government, which they did. So the HR functions were pulled out of the 17 or 18 state agencies and centralized under a new department that was created as Human Resources Department, and a new Secretary of HR was then hired and appointed. The Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer was a new post that was created. Delaware did not have such an office or an officer, so that position was created. Governor Carney signed into law an anti-discrimination policy because the state did not have a uniform anti-discrimination policy. And one of the add-ons that I also worked on was creating a chapter of the Delaware of Blacks in Government, which is a national organization. So we created a local chapter because we knew that there needed to be a support system for people outside of the protocols and the mechanisms that were in place to file a complaint or to pursue a lawsuit, there needed to be some support with other state employees, because people were very much suffering in silence and in isolation. And so that chapter was started back in 2016. So where are we now? The work ahead. The work ahead is to really focus on accountability, monitoring, evaluation, and action. And so what I'm sharing with you here are just some recent reports that have been published by the state agencies on racial equity and also sort of the status of workforce diversity within state government, and the actions that those agencies and those departments are continuing to work on since this campaign. And those reports can be found online. I've not reviewed them, but what I do know is that there's still deep-rooted issues within state government, and the systemic and the structural issues really have not been fully addressed. And when you have a system where individuals have been working there for 20 and 30 years, that middle management is where the problems really sit and lie. So the person who is a manager, who's a director, who's been there for 25, 30 years, and keeps and maintains that culture within the organization, is where the problems typically persist. And the state, unfortunately, in my opinion, has not been as serious, and I'm going to use that word, serious, about really addressing that by firing people and holding people really accountable for their behavior and the egregious things that have happened to the folks in the workplace. And so there are all of these protocols in place in terms of, from an HR standpoint, what you have to do in order to justifiably fire someone or release someone. And the state has, in some instances, recoiled at doing that. Case in point, I'll give you a good example. The person who was throwing the banana peels at the Black supervisor who worked for DART, that person was fired, and justly so. He then, through, I think, the union, filed a wrongful termination suit against the state of Delaware. And then the state of Delaware settled with him for some six-figure number. So, what happens is when you start to address these issues, you have to anticipate that you're going to get backlash. You have to anticipate that there will be lawsuits and there will be litigation. But you have to take a position of no tolerance or zero tolerance in these situations. And the state, unfortunately, at times is cowardly, in my opinion, in terms of taking a real firm stance and dealing with those actors, those bad actors, to weed them out. And when you don't do that, it sends two very, concerning messages. One, it sends a message to the perpetrator that there's no accountability and that you can sort of get away with doing these things. And two, it sends a message to the victim that nothing will happen to these individuals. So I better just keep my head down and just be quiet and do my time so that I can retire and leave. And that's the culture that exists in so many of these state agencies. So there are problems on both sides that really need to be addressed, and the expertise that's needed to fix some of these problems exists, and it exists outside of the state of Delaware. There are other state agencies, there are other firms and consulting groups and agencies that have been able to work with state governments and assist them in terms of shifting the culture, changing the culture, and implementing new systems of accountability so that you minimize this type of behavior and culture from continuing to expand and grow. So I'm sharing with you now just a few slides about, just sort of the state of affairs in Delaware, because I want you to see the connection between how our government operates. The state of Delaware is one of the largest employers in Delaware. So all of the agencies that are covered have tentacles in our community in different ways. And there are a number of reports that have come out and that continue to come out that give a real good snapshot of the current state of affairs and social condition of Black people, of people of color in the state of Delaware. And so we need to connect the two in terms of how state government functions, which is a government body, which has responsibility for good governance, delivering social services, and providing assistance for individuals and people, and the socioeconomic conditions that we see in Delaware. So there was a great report that was done by Prosperity Now. This was funded by JP Morgan Chase, a wealth and prosperity report in 2019, and it talked about racial economic inequality in Wilmington, and that it is the worst than what we see nationally for Black and Latino households. Another report is, this was just a news article that was posted some time ago, and it talked about Wilmington as one of the hardest places to achieve economic mobility in the United States. A new tool from the Census Bureau shows nowhere else in Delaware there's so little economic mobility. It's hard to find many places in the US where those who grew up in low-income families are making as little as $14,000 a year. So this is Wilmington, this is Delaware, the corporate capital of the world. You have all this wealth here. Black people make up 23%, roughly 23% of the population. But in terms of socioeconomic status and representation at the senior level and at the executive level, whether you're talking about in the private sector or the public sector, that type of representation is non-existent. It doesn't exist. Delaware has the highest prison incarceration rate in its region. Black people constitute 23% of the state residents, but we represent 56% of the incarcerated population. Recently, the state engaged in a disparity study, and they looked at contracts, procurement specifically. And again, this ties to state government because state government, controls the procurement process and how much business they do, who they do business with. So the study of state contracts ordered by the General Assembly finds race and gender disparities. The audit of state contracts finds race and gender disparities. So when you have, again, a culture where you have racist people and individuals who are maintaining the status quo, they control the procurement process. They control who gets contracts. They control these systems that are in place as well. And so that's where, why these numbers are so important, and we need to connect the dots in terms of how all of this works. And just to give you an example, here's a copy of the procurement table for Delaware. And if you look at this, you'll see in procurement categories for business ownership, and I think this is for construction, but it says that 0.93% of the procurement contracts went to African Americans, and then you see the other data points there statistically. Non-MWBE, meaning these are white men receive 91.16% of the state procurement contracts. Overwhelmingly disproportionate, right? And this is important because it connects to business and business opportunities and who's getting work and who's able to build wealth and who's able to build and create business enterprises in the state. So that was the state of Delaware. The same thing, Wilmington releases a disparity study recently, and the report addressed fairness, accessibility, inclusiveness of the city and the systems for obtaining or purchasing goods and services, as well as professional and non-professional services. Same thing, non-DBE, which would be non-diverse business enterprises, 93.26%. So these are white men in the top line. And these are those are the percentages of the contracts that they received in the city of Wilmington, which is over 60% African American. All right. So just recently, the Wilmington City Council called for a task force to be established to look at reparations and the study and the development of reparations. That report was done and completed. I don't know the status of it and what happens next, but this type of initiative is designed, this type of reparations initiative is designed to examine these issues that were just highlighted here in my presentation, and begin to put together and look at what are some of the solutions in terms of moving towards racial equity, addressing the harm, addressing the disparities that exist in state government as well, and in communities that have been harmed by slavery, but also years and years and years of discrimination as well. So I leave you with this quote by Desmond Tutu: "True peace must be anchored in justice and an unwavering commitment to universal rights for all humans, regardless of ethnicity, religion, gender, national origin, or any other identity attribute." I love Desmond Tutu. I think he's a great example, along with so many other great leaders and faith-based leaders that we can turn to for modeling the type of leadership and humanity and spirit of humanity, I should say, that we all need to adopt. And certainly Dr. King is another. So that concludes my presentation. I am available to answer any questions you may have. I know I said a whole lot, but I hope it was informative and gave you a sense of the work that I was leading 10 years ago in the state of Delaware. And mind you, I was not compensated for the work. This was done because it needed to get done. What turned out to be what I thought was a personal sort of project in terms of working with a family member who was having these issues and trying to assist him with this process, it snowballed and evolved into this statewide initiative, because once I learned that it wasn't isolated and he wasn't the only one who was experiencing these issues and having these challenges, the spirit wouldn't let me let it go. And so I stayed the course and moved the needle as much as I could with the very, very limited resources that I had. I invested my own money at times to just keep things going because it was so necessary to do.